Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. Would ask everyone in-house to make that last check that your cell phones have been turned off as a courtesy. We will possibly have a little bit of noise coming from underneath us as construction goes on. I do warn people that we are still looking to see if there's any gold buried under Capitol Hill. We've got plenty of use for it. Our program, of course, will be posted on the Heritage homepage following today's presentation for everyone's future reference. We, of course, have copies of Dr. Vogel's book available for your purchase and further discussion. And hosting our program today is the director of our B. Kenneth Simon Center for Principles in Politics, David Azrad. Please welcome him. David.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Modern progressive liberalism is unquestionably the dominant political ideology of our age, not just in America, but throughout the West. It shapes our discourse, molds our minds, and forms our character. As Kenneth Minogue already wrote in his book, The Liberal Mind, published in 1963, mind you, at the present time, most of us are, in some degree or other, liberal. It is only the very cynical, the unassailably religious, or the consistently nostalgic who have remained unaffected. Now, you would think, given liberalism's great successes and pervasive presence, that there would be countless books on the subjects. But when you start digging around at your local library, at a bookstore, at a university library, you don't find that many. There are incomparably more books on communism and fascism, two ideologies that have been consigned to the ash heap of history, than there are on modern liberalism. Universities, by and large, teach no classes on modern liberalism. They teach a few on conservatism as a way to placate conservative donors. Here, let's throw you this bone, and then we can go back to Sex Week and undoing white privilege. But they don't teach any on liberalism. Liberals are also not that interested in studying liberalism. After all, it's the air that they breathe. Why study the obvious? What we call liberalism, they call enlightened, compassionate pragmatism, the normal and natural way of thinking for anybody who just wants to help build a better world. The task, therefore, falls on conservatives and libertarians to study, explain, and account for contemporary liberalism. And here, for the most part, they fall short. Listening to conservatives and libertarians describe liberalism, I'm often left wondering, why would anybody in their right mind sign up for this? So you hate America, you want to take away my liberties, grow the size of government, and I'm supposed to go along with this because, to which they reply, handouts. Oh yeah, that's a compelling answer. Because Bill de Blasio carried the Upper West Side because wealthy Manhattanites want more handouts from City Hall. And Hillary Clinton, of course, is a liberal because she and her family would have starved to death were it not for food stamps when Bill left office dead broke. No, the most powerful appeal of liberalism lies in its claim to possess a monopoly on compassion and in the concomitant moral preening it fosters in its adherents. Liberals have, in effect, modified Descartes' famous saying, I care, therefore I am. And I'm not just anybody, I'm a good person. Most conservatives and libertarians underappreciate the seductive power of liberalism's appeal to the noble. That's the key. It presents itself as being wholly in the service of others, and thereby fosters a sense of moral high-mindedness. And what an easy virtue liberal compassion is. You don't actually need to help others. Others can take care of that. You just need to care, to feel their pains, in the words of one of our former presidents. And what about the conservatives who point out all the manifold failures of liberal compassion? The ruined lives, the broken community, the dashed dreams. There's a quote by FDR that Bill first drew my attention to, and for that I'm very grateful. It's a wonderful line. FDR says, governments can err. Presidents do make mistakes. But the immortal Dante tells us that divine justice weighs the sins of the cold-blooded and the sins of the warm-hearted on different scales. Better the occasional faults of a government that lives in a spirit of charity than the consistent omissions of a government frozen in the ice of its own indifference. These are the options as the left sees it: the spirit of charity or the iceberg of indifference. To help us better grasp the ins and outs of liberal compassion, I'm honored to welcome back to the Heritage Foundation Bill Vogel. Few people have written as intelligently about modern liberalism as he has. He wrote a dissertation on liberalism between the death of FDR and the end of the Carter presidency at Loyola University, where he earned his PhD. He writes an always insightful quarterly essay for the Claremont Review of Books, where he's a senior editor. He published an excellent first book in 2000 entitled Never Enough: America's Limitless Welfare State. And he now comes out with a book whose title is so good that I relish every single opportunity I have to say it out loud. The Pity Party, a mean-spirited diatribe against liberal compassion. Please join me in welcoming Bill Vogel.
Thank you, David. Ladies and gentlemen, very nice to be here. David has me come to Washington from time to time and then introduces me and gives a more cogent version of whatever it is I'm about to argue than anything I have prepared. And so it's a qualified thank you. I like this room very much. I see there are large pillars, however. I apologize to the obstructed view attendees. In the early 1950s, when television was becoming a thing in American life, the owner of the Philadelphia Phillies at their old ballpark thought that he was in the business of selling tickets to ball games and was very skeptical about allowing cameras in to televise the games. He didn't giving away for free what he was trying to sell. So finally, under pressure, he relented. But the deal was that there would be one camera positioned in the worst seat in the house. So it was at the farthest point behind the most columns, and the thinking was that if you didn't like that, then come out to the game and buy a ticket, you bum. So anyway, modern American liberalism and compassion. What's the deal? Kindness covers all my political principles, says President Obama. A prominent liberal writer asserts that the quality that really sets progressives apart is they care about other people, not just themselves. And conservatives shake their heads. Can liberals really be so fatuous as to believe that the profound challenges of politics, which have confronted and usually gotten the better of statesmen and philosophers for millennia, are in fact so simple that gentle admonitions to play nice are all we need to secure peace and justice? And are liberals really so self-righteous as to insist that opposition to or even skepticism about their project can be explained entirely in terms of their opponent's greed, cruelty, and pathological mean-spiritedness? Just today, there is an interview I did with Salon.com that went up on their website. Maybe I shouldn't, but I did anyway. Look at the comments section. Wherein I was described as a pretentious sociopath. My wife brought this to my attention. I said, darling, we both know I'm a salt-of-the-earth sociopath. Well, the short answer to the question, are liberals really this fatuous? Are they really this self-righteous? Are yes and yes. The longest possible answer is The Pity Party, now available in hardback and ebook editions. An in-between answer is that certain key features of modern liberalism and of compassion turn out to be made for each other, which is not to say that they're necessarily good for each other or for America. Let me mention three. First of all, liberals are in favor of the modern bargain. which holds that the most basic political problem, getting people to live together peaceably, can be solved by a social contract, a mutual non-aggression pact, where we agree to disagree about big, contentious questions, religion chief among them. Each individual is to be left free not only to pursue happiness, but to define it, subject only to the qualification that he'll pursue his happiness only in ways that allow an equal maximal latitude for everyone else covered by the social contract to pursue theirs. Liberals are not alone in favoring the modern bargain. So do conservatives, and so do the large portion of the American population that doesn't think about politics in left-right terms at all, or think about politics much generally. What's notable about liberalism, though, is that it wants all the advantages of the modern bargain, but also the advantages of the pre-modern bargain. Liberals want the maximal autonomy, different strokes for different folks, but they also want togetherness, a profound sense of caring and sharing that pervades and unites society. As Hillary Clinton lamented in her Politics of Meaning speech in 1993, we lack meaning in our individual lives and meaning collectively. We lack a sense that our lives are part of some greater effort, that we are connected to one another. The pre-modern or ancient bargain also rested on what it took to be self-evident truths. Indeed, truths so self-evident that they were not spelled out in any Declaration of Independence. The central one was that a nation composed of all different kinds of people, holding all different kinds of beliefs, could not possibly cohere or endure. Instead, political unity was predicated on a shared moral and teleological understanding, a distinct answer to the big questions about how to live and what to live for, that was comprehensive, detailed, exacting, and enforced, usually in ways that were severe. Nothing less could bind a society together or imbue individual lives with dignity and meaning. What's so great about compassion, from the liberal perspective, is that it solves this dilemma. We can have the best of both bargains, ancient and modern. The perfect liberal is someone so compassionate that he cares profoundly about how you are, but so non-judgmental that he could not care less about what you do. It is on this basis that liberalism believes it has reconciled the demands of individualism with those of community. This brings me to my second observation about liberalism and compassion. Like every political disposition, modern liberalism ultimately rests on certain precepts about human nature. The liberal view is distinctly hopeful on that score. We can understand this perspective by contrasting it with the sensibility that characterized the American founding, which viewed human nature with suspicion and resignation. The founders were, as a result, preoccupied with making the best of that bad situation. In the Federalist Papers, for example, James Madison admitted that a constitution arranging for ambition to counteract ambition, and thereby supplying the defect of better motives through opposite and rival interests, said nothing very complimentary about human nature. But, he argued, the age-old problem of arranging for self-interested citizens to obey the law and do their duty, and for self-interested officials not to abuse their authority, was the greatest and least flattering of all reflections on human nature. Liberals don't like any of that. They think the solution to our most fundamental political problems does not lie in institutional arrangements that supply the defect of better motives. What we really need are better motives. And heavy reliance on the better angels of our nature is a much smaller risk, they believe, than perpetuating the self-interested conduct by counting on it to fuel the political machinery. President Franklin Roosevelt told the nation that selfishness was the greatest danger facing America. People have learned that they can carry their burdens effectively only by cooperation, he said. And this realization has led them to understand that freedom and opportunity, I quote, do not mean a license to climb upwards by pushing other people down. The belief that humans are not inherently selfish, which means that their relations with one another are not necessarily invidious, borrows heavily from the philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and not coincidentally, Rousseau was the great advocate of compassion. He believed compassion was derived from our docility and guilelessness, latent since we left the state of nature for civil society, but not irretrievably lost. As such, it was also the most important element for building a world where we would be free to define and pursue our individual happiness, and in doing so, unite with others marching to the beat of their own drummers in a perfectly integrated community. As the Students for Democratic Action said in its founding Port Huron statement in 1962, men have unrealized potential for self-cultivation, self-direction, self-understanding, and creativity. Accordingly, the statement declared, the goal of man and society should be human independence, which, it stipulated, is very different from egoistic individualism. The object is not to have one's own way so much as it is to have a way that is one's own. Rousseau argued that compassion's best aspect was precisely that it came naturally to those who did not let their reasoning get in its way. As such, it relied on something more basic and accessible than the calculations necessary for ambition to beneficially counteract ambition. A murder may with impunity be committed under a philosopher's window, Rousseau wrote, but he has only to put his hands to his ears and argue with himself to prevent nature, which is shocked within him, from identifying itself with the unfortunate sufferer. The reason compassion was so reliable was that although it was not self-interested in the way Madison accepted as inevitable, it was nonetheless self-regarding. When the strength of an expansive soul makes me identify myself with my fellow, and I feel that I am, so to speak, in him, it is in order not to suffer that I do not want him to suffer, Rousseau wrote. I am interested in him for love of myself, which inspires in me the desire of my well-being in whatever place I feel my existence. Love of men, derived from love of self, is the principle of human justice. The Latinate word, compassion, means, literally, to suffer together. Sometimes we suffer together because we suffer identically. This is the compassion of a support group. Nobody else really knows what we're going through. And so when you share, when you talk about it, you're talking with people who truly and completely understand you, who've been there. Usually, though, we suffer together in the sense that your hunger, illness, homelessness, distress, fill in the blank, affects me, makes me feel bad, and that bad feeling gives me a reason to concern myself with your suffering. A third point about modern liberalism and compassion. Liberals have come to emphasize compassion more and more because they have decided to emphasize progress less and less. The ism of the progressive ism that laid the foundation for the New Deal and all subsequent iterations of modern American liberalism was a belief in progress. Natural scientists had learned the laws of nature, which explained the physical world, and their discoveries gave mankind new capacities to control nature through technology. Now, the progressives of a century or more ago believed, social scientists would arrive at an equally penetrating grasp of the laws of history, creating quote, a science that can foresee the progress of humankind, direct it, and accelerate it, in Condorcet's phrase. By the middle of the 20th century, however, progressivism's bland confidence in progress was no longer sustainable. Part of the problem was the two astounding, horrific world wars in a 31-year span, and the emergence of murderous totalitarian regimes mocked the assurance that mankind was ready and eager to reject atavistic barbarism and embrace experts' master plans for directing and accelerating progress. In my compassion, I wonder if there's got to be a seat here, sir. You want one? Come on down, come on. We're glad to have you. Can I get you anything to drink? Okay. Nice sandwich, perhaps? Okay. But the bigger difficulty was within liberalism itself. It responded to the rise of totalitarianism by making an all-in bet on the fact-value distinction and moral relativism. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which is not too sure that it's right, said Judge Learned Hand in 1944, a line earnestly repeated ever since by many liberals, including Presidents Clinton and Obama. Among the problems with this formulation is that it renders untenable the idea that we can know the truth about progress. That is, there was no coherent way for liberals to be skeptical about every other claim to absolute knowledge, while insisting that social scientists had somehow ascertained objectively true insights into the future. But this meant progressive values were just some people's subjective preferences, rather than conclusions derived from facts that were true and empirically verifiable. Compassion has proven to be extremely valuable in this regard, and as a result has played a growing role in liberals' rhetoric and self-understanding since 1945. Instead of justifying the liberal project on the basis of esoteric knowledge about progress, ascertained by a priesthood of social scientists, liberal compassion justifies it on the basis of an elemental emotion experienced and comprehended by all. This is a far more democratic approach. By putting liberals on the side of the many instead of the few, it spares them troubled consciences about being elitists, and also improves liberalism's electoral prospects. Better still, the politics of compassion gets around the problem created when relativism reduces the liberal agenda to a subjective preference. Yes, compassionate liberals can now say, our project for alleviating suffering does rest on nothing more fundamental than our instinctive sympathy for those who suffer. And what of it? Would it be better to formulate policies on the basis of callous indifference to suffering? Compassion gives liberals the best of both worlds then. It's a subjective emotion, so invoking it means liberals can still maintain that they are epistemologically diffident rather than dogmatists dangerously sure that they're right. But because it's an emotion that everyone shares, admires, and understands, compassion gives liberalism a basis that feels as sturdy as an objectively true axiom. Moreover, making compassion the rationale for liberalism lends itself to pathologizing liberals' opponents. Yes, many liberals will admit, there is something ridiculous about the liberal do-gooder, instinctively ready to boycott Naugahyde the moment some provocateur tells him the Naga is an endangered species. But if the alternative is to be a do-badder or a do-nothinger, the liberal do-gooder always winds up benefiting from the comparison. Finally, making compassion rather than progress, the clincher for the liberal argument has not required renouncing progress just rendering it amorphous. Liberals are increasingly fond of saying that their agenda is on the right side of history, and its opponents are on the wrong side. One journalist dug through Barack Obama's presidential utterances to find that, at one time or another, the Arab Spring, Obamacare, sanctions against Iran, the administration's counterterrorism policies, comprehensive immigration reform, women's rights, arms control, and the entirety of Harry Reid's work as leader of the Senate Democrats had been on the right side of history. Happily, such pronouncements do not run afoul of the admonition not to be too sure one is right, since all they really mean is that the world will indeed fulfill its destiny of becoming a nicer and nicer place, as long as the nice people committed to that nice goal never capitulate to the mean people who want the world to be a mean place. Let me now describe 4 ways in which liberal compassion is problematic, both in terms of leading to intellectual confusion and to practical complications. First, being simultaneously compassionate and non-judgmental, caring about how people are, but not about what they do, disregards the many important ways that what they do determines how they are. Liberalism's moral paradigm for social welfare programs is the relief effort after a natural disaster, the severity of which banishes any possibility that the victims suffer as a result of their own errors of commission or omission. When human beings are left vulnerable and desperate by events beyond their control, we want to help, the Washington Post columnist Matt Miller wrote. He argued that the moral logic of supporting disaster reliefs for victims of something like the Philippines typhoon of a year ago also requires supporting Obamacare. We say such victims deserve help, he wrote, because they are suffering through no fault of their own. For the same reason, liberals try to frame every issue they can in terms of children's needs and vulnerabilities. In his 1996 State of the Union address, President Clinton informed a bemused nation, "For the first time since the dawn of the nuclear age, there is not a single Russian missile pointed at America's children." But governing an entire nation on the basis of being nice to children inevitably infantilizes those who are not children. Indeed, the politics of compassion insists that we apply to the relationship of one citizen to another the same moral logic that guides the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. The sufferer is just a sufferer, not a moral agent. David, do you keep looking at me because you're enthralled or because I'm running up against my time limit?
Because I'm enthralled.
Thank you. Okay. And I too am enthralled. As C.S. Lewis wrote, kindness merely as such cares not whether its object becomes good or bad, provided only that it escapes suffering. Each of our lives will turn out in a particular way because of the interplay of forces within our control and forces beyond it. Apportioning causality between the one kind and the other is never going to be exact. But it's a perverse, reckless sort of compassion that urges people to dwell on all the ways they cannot be expected to help themselves, and so must rely on the sympathy and generosity of others, rather than on all the ways that lives, lost my place, individuals, families, and communities characterized by discipline and determination can prevail against even the most severe challenges. History provides no basis for the belief that a promising path for individuals or groups to acquire significant, durable social and economic advantages is to feel sorry for themselves. or induce others to feel sorry for and guilty about them. What the embrace of victimhood secures instead is the debilitating advantage of being chronically dependent on the kindness of strangers. Second point. Liberals are, on account of compassion, weirdly uninterested in whether their project achieves its stated goals. Pity is about how deeply I can feel, the late Jean Bethke Elshtain, a political theorist, argued. And in order to feel this way, to experience the rush of my own pious reaction, I need victims the way an addict needs drugs. On account of compassion, liberals care about helping much less than they care about caring. Because compassion gives the empathizer a self-regarding reason to care about the empathizee's suffering, it becomes a matter of desperate urgency to do something for the sufferer. But whether or not we accomplish something that actually alleviates the suffering that moved us is a second or third or fourth order concern. And lo, many social programs don't seem to work very well. And liberals who claim to get up every morning determined to reduce the suffering in the world don't seem all that concerned that these programs are wasteful, misdirected, or ineffective. Compassion bears much of the blame for this baffling anomaly. Third, liberals' hopeful, trusting view of human nature leads, counterintuitively, to strident denunciations of those who disagree with them or who stymie the progress of the liberal project. Believing that the world's default option is to be a nice place, liberals explain all the ways in which it remains an ugly and difficult one in terms of villainy, stupidity, or psychological pathologies. Thus, the different nations are meant to get along. Indeed, Strobe Talbot, president of the Brookings Institution and veteran of Bill Clinton's State Department, looks forward to nationhood as we know it being obsolete by the end of the 21st century. Instead, he wrote, all states will recognize a single global authority. And within the nations, for such time as they still exist, people of different races, ethnicities, and religions are supposed to enjoy effortless fraternity simply by practicing mutual respect and forbearance. Liberals are communitarians, but they want a logical impossibility. Communities that have insides but not outsides, since leaving anyone out of any community causes hurt feelings and resentment. But of course, insideness is what makes belonging to any community meaningful and important. And insideness necessarily requires and is defined against outsideness. A community to which everyone belongs is a community to which no one really belongs. Men and women are also meant to get along equally, easily, and interchangeably. It is becoming clear that the culmination of the sexual and feminist revolutions is the de-eroticization of sexuality. The force Socrates called divine madness, which gave rise to the yearning, conflict, jealousy, and betrayal depicted in great works of art over the centuries, turns out to be no big deal. According to the ideology of affirmative consent, sexuality can be safely domesticated, turned into a realm of no less but no more than harmless fun, if seduction is jettisoned in favor of the forthright negotiation and informed consent we expect of any reputable car rental agency. Liberalism exists to solve problems and regards every source of dissatisfaction or discord as a problem, not an aspect of the human condition that we might ameliorate but can never eliminate. The belief that humans are naturally disposed to live with one another in ways that are peaceful, respectful, and mutually uplifting helps explain, but doesn't justify, liberals' vilification of those alleged to have caused the problems they seek to solve, or who oppose the solutions they seek to implement. As Christopher Lasch wrote 20 years ago in The Revolt of the Elites, when confronted with resistance to their initiatives, liberals betray the venomous hatred that lies not far beneath the smiling face of upper middle class benevolence. Opposition makes humanitarians forget the liberal virtues they claim to uphold. They become petulant, self-righteous, intolerant. In the heat of political controversy, they find it impossible to conceal their contempt for those who stubbornly refuse to see the light. Finally, liberals' hopeful, trusting view of human nature jeopardizes many valuable things, the modern bargain chief among them. They are, for example, inclined to interpret, by which I mean to misinterpret, people who detest our way of life as people who aspire to it. In his book, Terror and Liberalism, which I highly recommend, Paul Berman tries to disabuse us of that error by examining the writings of Sayyid Qutb, the chief theoretician of Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamist movements subsequently derived from it. Berman concludes that Qutb's deepest quarrel was not with America's failure to uphold its principles. His quarrel was with the principles. The truly dangerous element in American life, Berman has Qutb believing, lay in the separation of church and state and resulting laxity of religious standards and convictions. Tolerant, non-judgmental liberals' instinctive response when terrorists inspired by such beliefs commit random acts of mass murder is, in Berman's words, to suggest ways in which the apparent mass pathologies were anything but pathologies and terror was reasonable and explicable and perhaps even kind of admirable. Of the recent ISIS beheading videos, Berman has written, "The spectacle of black uniformed holy warriors conducting human sacrifices gives us chills, but it also makes us sigh. We tell ourselves, here is what comes of failing to provide adequate social services to young men in blighted neighborhoods." The danger posed by liberal optimism about human nature is most acute when we consider an ideology that has inspired terrorist groups to murder thousands, but it is a problem more generally. As the late political scientist Joseph Cropsey wrote 50 years ago, the liberal view is consistent with itself in applying to domestic as well as to foreign affairs the dictum that trust edifies and absolute trust edifies absolutely. In other words, whether the problem is posed by terrorists, street criminals, welfare cheats, campus riots, or a totalitarian enemy like the Soviet Union, liberals' first reaction is to believe that if decent people simply appeal to the decency latent in others, all will ultimately be well. Conservatives are not always clear or in agreement with one another about what exactly we are trying to conserve, or why exactly it stands in need of conservation. I submit that American conservatism's task is to conserve our Republican experiment in self-government. Because republics are permanently vulnerable, the work of sustaining them is endlessly daunting but permanently necessary. As Abraham Lincoln said in 1861, "Is there in all republics this inherent and fatal weakness? Must a government of necessity be too strong for the liberties of its own people or too weak to maintain its own existence?" Conservatives oppose liberalism because we think it's mistaken. If liberals have their way, we'll end up with the worst of both worlds: a nanny state too strong for the liberties of our people, and a national security apparatus too diffident, too committed to international social work to defend our interests abroad. But we oppose liberalism also because we know it's attractive in ways that make it especially dangerous. I'm an employee of one conservative think tank, the Claremont Institute, speaking here as the guest of another, and even I wish liberalism were true. I wish that people and nations were so strongly disposed to get along with one another that eternal vigilance was not the price of liberty. I wish that wealth were self-generating so that the gratifying process of distributing it could be disengaged from the challenging process of producing it. I wish the elemental emotion of compassion harbored so much power and wisdom that it provided clear answers to all the daunting questions about how to govern a republic of 319 million people in a world of 7.2 billion people. I'm pretty sure, however, that these wishes are, and always will be, wishes. To take them seriously makes the hard work of governing even harder, and the danger of steering a course between anarchy and tyranny even more dangerous. Liberals are as proud of their idealism as of their compassion. Conservatives are, rightly, very afraid of both. Edward Kennedy spoke at the memorial for his brother Robert in 1968 by quoting a line that RFK often used in speeches. Some men see things as they are and say why. I dream things that never were and say why not. The Kennedy speechwriters may not have informed their employers that they were paraphrasing George Bernard Shaw, who wrote, "You see things and you say why, but I dream things that never were, and I say why not?" The line appears in the play Back to Methuselah. The speaker, addressing Eve in the Garden of Eden, is the serpent. Everything is possible, he goes on to assure Eve. Everything. Thank you. Q&A? Would you? I do?
I'll let you just make sure that one of the interns
Okay.
arrives. And I would ask you to pose a question and not offer a diatribe of your own.
The,
Bill, you can field the questions yourself.
no, you have the microphone. You pick. That's why I'm fielding the questions. I'm outsourcing this horrific responsibility. There we go.
Frank Mannheim, George Mason University. Is this working?
It should be.
Not as a microphone. It's an excellent paperweight.
Well, I'll try to speak.
Just scream. Yes.
Given your very compelling point about how attractive liberalism is, I'm wondering about the strategies for meeting it. For example, I have the impression that some of the European countries that have passed us in per capita income, like Switzerland, Sweden, and Norway, that may change now with the banking, the currency rates, but never mind. They have apparently embraced a social net to remove that from contention, but they have liberalized and decentralized their regulatory system to free up their economic enterprises to have much more freedom than we have. What would you consider about that strategy?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it has some elements worth thinking about carefully. I think, picky point of detail, I think Norway, it may have greater per capita GDP than we do as a result of oil. Switzerland as a result of banking. Sweden less, actually. Most of the Scandinavian, most of the countries that the American left looks at longingly actually have per capita GDPs that are like a fourth lower than ours. So a good question would be, that's going to enter into the political arena. If that's our model, are we comfortable with taking what might be a step back in terms of economic prosperity? But that aside, I think that conservatism, and I get into this a little in pity party, excuse me, needs to sort of reckon with the fact that the welfare state is an old thing now. If the conservative project or campaign is to undo it, this is a very daunting prospect. A colleague of mine at the Claremont Institute, has now moved on to other things, wrote a doctoral dissertation on William Rusher, the publisher of National Review magazine for many years. And he dug up a quote I'd never heard before that I liked. Rusher said, looking back on his life and career, that he realized that what he was really trying to do all those years was to rerun the 1936 election until Alf Landon beat FDR. That's Don Quixote is a great book and all, but I think I don't think that's what the American conservative enterprise can be. Things have changed. I think we need to take up and it's a hard challenge, and I don't have a blueprint that makes it just right, but take up the challenge that Irving Kristol made 20 years ago now to define a conservative welfare state. Because I don't think that a nation without one is anywhere on the horizon.
Hi, I'm Jay Koss with the Weekly Standard.
Yeah.
And I was hoping to get you to talk a little bit about how you see the socio-economic origins of the liberalism that you describe. I'm struck that this liberalism is something that, I think of John L. Lewis or Sidney Hillman or Walter Reuther. This is not necessarily a liberalism that they would recognize. That liberalism before World War II was a liberalism based politically on a farmer-labor alliance, was rooted in the concept and elevation of work, and that vis-a-vis foreign affairs, that these were the liberals who founded Americans for Democratic Action, purged communists, and that make this liberalism that you're describing strikes me not so much as farmer labor, but more post-war middle class, insofar as it's radical, it's not Marxist, but more postmodern. Can you?
Yeah, as far as you sketched it out, I think that's right. I guess one way of my answer to your question is going to kind of be to restate what the point you've laid out. I think that there's kind of a bottom-up liberalism and there's a top-down liberalism. And the Sidney Hillman, John Lewis, that's bottom-up liberalism, more class-based, more working people taking control of their destiny, seizing what is or ought to be theirs. I think that the top-down liberalism, the sort of Lady Bountiful social work aspect of that, socio-economic. Oh, is this the drilling we were promised? Oh.
Those are the workers.
Yes, they heard your question. I think in some ways the top-down aspect of liberalism comes in a way from sort of the decay of religion, and especially Protestantism. I gave you a little etymological tour through compassion. Pity is also an interesting word in that it's derived centuries ago from piety. And I think pity is sort of what's left of piety after you bleach out all of the otherworldly aspects of it. We still care for one another. That's what pity does. But we no longer care for one another in the sense of saving souls or redeeming lives. We don't want suffering. And I think that sense that that kind of caring is what defines a good person, is where the top-down liberalism sort of draws its moral energy. Sir. What? Oh, I was pointing to a gentleman in the back row, but who needs a microphone? A working microphone this time.
Thank you so much. Would you comment on this, please? It seems to me that, and I engaged in a conversation with a person, a liberal who was on the Illinois, running for political office in Illinois last night about this. It seems to me that what you have
Don't be
described.
coy. Tell us who it was.
It was for a state office.
Oh, okay.
So it seems
So
to
you
me
are being
that
coy.
what you've described so capably, but is really a trompe l'oeil, that compassion is something that has cloaked pure political ambition, like in Venezuela giving out an apartment, which might appear to be compassion, but it's really a political device to gain a vote. Don't you dignify liberalism by cloaking it in the clothing of compassion?
Well, but it still looks ugly after I dignify it. If it walked out of the shop looking great, that would be one thing. And it's also the case, it seems to me conservatism thinks it's helping itself, but is for the most part hurting itself when it tries to win the game after the opening kickoff. And it tries to do that by characterizing its liberal adversary in the least flattering way from the outset, and then winning this thumping victory against what might turn out to be a straw man, or at least a depiction of liberalism that emphasizes all the warts and none of the virtues. I think that conservatives will do the cause of simple clarity and intellectual honesty more good, as well as the conservative cause, insofar as they are not the same, by exerting ourselves to understand liberals as they understand and present themselves, to sort of start with, let's assume for the sake of the argument that their ideals, their noble motives really are what drives them. I think it often turns out underneath that what you say is right, that there's a lot of rent seeking, that even the well-intentioned programs quickly descend into sort of sloppy and cynical exercises. But I think we win a better argument if we say, even if you give them all the credit of the doubt, you push all of that stuff aside, there are still big problems with liberalism. And so I've tried to do it from that perspective.
There are no liberals in America. There are only liars and people who have been lied to, I think. But this is a macro question. It's easy to take apart liberal policy case by case.
Mm-hmm.
They're always wrong, and their results always fail. But how do you give the macro argument saying, progressives have been working on this for 100 years. Look at where America was 100 years ago. Look at where it is today. You'll say it's there because, despite liberal policies, whereas, and a liberal would say we're so far advanced because of liberal policies. And if we can just implement it here in America,
Yeah.
it hasn't worked anywhere else, but we can get it done here. What's your
Yeah.
answer to the macro question?
Well, I think it's a real rhetorical thing of theirs, and I think it's a post hoc propter hoc argument, right? As you've described it.
I meant to use those words.
Why didn't you? Then I wouldn't have had to and sound like a pretentious sociopath. But I think that sort of all we can do is all we can do. Among the people who've written usefully about this is economist Deirdre McCloskey, who talks about how with the sort of bourgeois revolution, the establishment of the belief some 200 years ago that wealth creation was respectable, that this revolution in attitudes has led to something she says as important as practically the discovery of fire or domesticating animals, sowing crops. For about 2 centuries now, inflation-adjusted per capita GDP in the nations that have taken this attitude seriously has increased by about 1.5% a year. With the magic of compound interest, that means we're about 13 times better off than people in the early 19th century. So the thing that really improves lives in the ways that liberals talk about is economic growth, prosperity. I think liberals and conservatives agree that it's the necessary condition. Now, the sort of the argument then goes beyond, after you address the necessary condition, what more is needed for a sufficient condition for everybody to lead, as many people as possible to lead flourishing lives? And I think the spectrum goes from conservatives who say almost nothing. If you have economic growth in a night watchman state, you've done all you can and all you should. To with the collapse of Marxism, with the collapse of any serious belief in a centrally planned economy as a viable alternative, I think the left side of the spectrum now is just, well, if we mess around aggressively, then we'll make up for all of the defects in terms of unhappiness between pure economic growth and genuine optimal social situations. And the debate takes place between those poles. So I think, all we can do is to say when that sort of argument goes up, that the key thing we're talking about here is greater economic prosperity. And what we do with it after that is a question that a self-governing republic has to debate earnestly and intelligently.
We'll take one last one, Bill.
Okay.
So.
This is sorry.
Al Milliken, AM Media. What role do you see religion playing in this, and do you have anything more to say about social justice?
Well, I think it's interesting that probably the most influential leftist intellectual of the past 30, 40 years, who died a few years ago, Richard Rorty, was the grandson of Walter Rauschenberg, the kind of chief theoretician of the social gospel. For Rauschenberg, Protestant piety culminated in a movement that was deeply engaged with social justice. And you still see an energetic, although not, I would say intellectually vibrant, but not very successful in terms of growing denominational strength, sort of a liberal Protestantism. All of those denominations have suffered a steep decline. And I think that the progression from grandfather to grandson sort of shows you what the problem is there. Once the thing that your church is about is social justice, is once the cosmological aspects that seem fundamental to religion have in fact kind of disappeared, that all that's left is all that was left for Rorty, who was not a believer, and who simply said, he took this sort of, in a sense, this kind of smiling nihilism towards the issue, and said, well, nobody knows what's good or bad, to say what's right or wrong. We just know that decent people want decent things. So I think that as much as the gravitational pull of excessive sort of engagement of religion with the world, yes, we're committed to justice, we're committed to saving lives and souls, but there's the constant danger of a slippery slope that leads to a descent where religion is no longer religion. But when it's no longer religion, it no longer possesses any real moral force. It's just another political enterprise. And its ability to influence and persuade and to speak with a kind of special moral authority is compromised and ultimately fades away.
The book is available outside for sale, and I'm sure Bill will be glad to sign copies if you'd like to. Please join me in thanking him again. Thank you, Bill.